Thank you so much, Ori. That was beautiful. Thank you. Now I would like to ask Dr. Pim Valkenburg, also a very good friend of the Rumi Forums, a good friend of ours, to come and speak now. He is a professor at Loyola University of Maryland in Baltimore, and he's going to speak a bit about the Rumi Forum and his work. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Ladies and gentlemen, when Jenna invited me to speak tonight, I was thinking, what shall I do? Because it was my feeling that it was a little bit strange for me, being a Christian theologian, to talk about the Rumi Forum, to talk about Ramadan, to talk about Iftar, since you should be standing here and talk to me about what it means to fast. So I thought, okay, the only way I can do this is to fast with you, at least for one day. And I remember talking to my daughter. I have an older daughter who still lives in the Netherlands. I came from the Netherlands 4 years ago, who said that she was doing that with a couple of friends. And you may know that in the Netherlands the situation between Muslims and other people who call themselves politicians of certain parties is kind of tense. So there was a kind of a demonstration from her side to do that. So I thought, okay, let me do that and let me see what happens. It was kind of difficult because today I had a faculty workshop for a special teaching program that I'm involved in at Loyola University in this fall. It began with a breakfast to get things started, which I had to skip. It went on with a lunch, which I had to skip, and it ended with a dinner, which I had to skip because I had to come here. So, of course, some of my colleagues asked me, are you on a diet? Do you have stomach troubles? What's the matter with you? I remember that I began thinking about the meaning of fasting when one of my students in the Netherlands wanted to write her master thesis about the meaning of fasting in Islam and Christianity. That was some time ago, some 15 years ago, before I think Iftar dinners were as common, although they are not very common, but for some of us they are already very common, not as common as they are now. 10 years ago I was invited to an Iftar dinner, and it's always very humbling to think that that was the case, not because of me, but because of my wife, who was a pastoral worker in a church, and she was invited, and I asked her, can I come with you? And I could come, so I was invited as well. And that is when I first met the people from the Hizmet movement, as I prefer to call it, or the movement of people who are inspired by Fethullah Gülen, whom you saw in the presentation earlier today. So that is in fact how my contacts with the different organizations of the Hizmet movement began. One of the things that my student during the writing of her thesis discovered was that we Catholics in the Netherlands had somehow lost the original meaning of fasting. So Ori has been talking splendidly about the original meaning of fasting in the Abrahamic religions, but in the 70s and in the 80s, for Catholics there was a kind of a shift, and I think that's true in some American churches as well, away from, let's say, the theological meaning of fasting to a social justice thing. So fasting meant giving up something in solidarity with the poor, concentrating on their needs, giving the money that you can spare to the third world, or eating only bread and water and giving the remainders to other people. And I think that's some of the things, I mean, we just talked about the Iftar tents. That's some of the things that you still do here at Rumi Forum. And I wouldn't say that that was incorrect, but it was a kind of a derived meaning of fasting. So for myself, the thing what always impresses me is and I'm working in the field of interreligious dialogue, is how we can learn from one another. And that is, in fact, what I want to talk about a little bit in the final part of my short presentation. So fasting, I think, and I will now give you kind of a very short parallel of what Ori just said, means three things. First of all, most superficially, it means to struggle with your own self, or just to quote Rumi for one time, to struggle with your nafs, with your soul, with yourself, with your lower inclinations, the baser instincts. Showing that you can overcome the urge for food and water, since there are more important things. That has to do, as I learned, with the virtue of sabr, which is for people who live in the desert, in that hot climate, a very important virtue. Know to wait, to have patience. It's ordinarily translated as patience. I think endurance is much better, because it's a kind of a powerful notion. It's not just be patient. Second, fasting means to concentrate on God. Concentrate, of at least that's for the monotheistic traditions, with your relation on God, and to a certain sense giving back to God what you have received from God. I remember sitting in one of the iftar dinners in the Netherlands, and one of my Muslim friends, we were together with some younger people, because we had a kind of an Abrahamic meeting of younger people, a kind of an Abrahamic youth event. And they were asking all kinds of questions. And it was during Ramadan. At that time it was in October. And they were asking my Muslim friend, why are you fasting? And all kinds of people came up with the ideas that you probably hear around you. It's good for your health system, it's good for your balance, etc., etc. But he ended up saying, well, God commanded it. And I remember that these Dutch boys and girls, they couldn't get it. I mean, so that's one of the elements, I would say, of fasting. It is about your relationship with God. And the third element, which might be the most important, is the social aspect. Coming together, and that is why we are sitting here together. And I know of some research that tells us, at least in Europe, you may know there are in Europe quite a lot of younger Muslims who are Muslims in name, but are not really practicing, not really observant. But they do share the event with Ramadan, because of the social meaning of Ramadan that is very important to them. So it's a time for new relationships, and if some relationships got lost, it's time to work on these relationships once again. So I think one of these relationships that we can renew once again during Ramadan is the relationship between the three Abrahamic religions. And that is because we can learn from one another. At the table here in front, we had a discussion earlier about ignorance being a very important aspect why we now have all these stories about Islam in the United States. Coming from Europe, I'm a little longer familiar, I guess, with some of these stories, but they have to do with a lot of ignorance. And that is why I think there are two texts in the Quran that has been, for me as a Christian theologian, always very important. The first one, and people who are working in dialogue will know the two texts that I will quote. The first text is Surah 49 verse 13. People, we created you all from a single man and a single woman, and made you into nations and tribes, so that you should get to know each other. This idea of getting to know each other, li ta'aruf in Arabic, I think is very important. And then there is this other text that has always puzzled me, from Surah Al-Ma'idah, the Surah of the table. If God wanted, He could have made you one community, but He wanted to test you in what He gave to you. Therefore, emulate one another in doing good. Istabiku al-khairat, which means try to do good try to be a kind of a mirror for another. And I think that's exactly what we can learn from one another's religious practices or other practices where we do good. If we see others doing these things, we reflect on our own traditions and see how we can improve what God has given to us. And that, for me, is the deepest meaning for interreligious dialogue. And I would really wish and hope that we, as Christians, Jews and Muslims, will act according to this divine wish. Not the political troubles associated with Ground Zero and new mosques, but trying to serve others in order to please God. And if I may summarize in one sentence what Jenna announced as the topic of my talk, namely what I learned from Rumi Forum and what I learned from Hoxha Effendi, from Fethullah Gulen, it is exactly that, to serve others, not because they will give you back, not because you will be famous or whatever, but because that is something that God has given you to do, and in the end you hope to give that back to the one who has created you. Thank you very much.